Let's do some useful things with strings. I'd mentioned before that you can use triple quotes to define a multi-line comment, but you can also use it to define a multi-line string literal, the way that I'm doing here. So if I load this file and then I print message, you can see it display as you'd expect. And if I just inspect the value, you'll see the same characters, only instead of going to a new line, the new lines are represented by \n. In a previous video, I've already described how you can use array-like syntax to access individual characters, but let's just remember that very briefly. So here at index 2 we have I. You can also use negative indices to wrap around from the back, so this is the trailing L in literal. You can also use slices, and if you remember the general syntax for slices, you have a starting index, an ending index, and a step size. So I could go from index 1 up to index 10, and that does not include index 10. I could go, if I leave off any of them, they default to, in the case of the start, the beginning of the list, in the case of end, the end of the list. So here I would default to the beginning of the list, going up to index 10. Here I would start at index 5, and then default to going to the end of the list. And then as an example of step, let's go from 1 to 20 with a step size of 3. So that's skipping 3 characters every single time. Or I guess skipping 2 characters because we are going to every third character. Okay, so in Java you know that strings are immutable, which means they can't be changed, and anything that you do that appears to be changing a string is actually creating a completely new string whose value is different. So the same thing is true in Python. So you might believe that because you can use array syntax, you could do something like this to replace the character at index 2 with a p, but because strings are immutable, you can't. It also prevents you from using the del operator to delete individual characters or slices. We've also gone over how you can use a for loop to iterate over every character in a string, so let's just look at that. For letter in message, print letter. And if I run this, you'll see that it displays each letter on its own line. So print is working like Java's print line. If you want print to work more like Java's print, you can specify an optional parameter called end, and so I'm setting end to be empty string, and now if I run it, it displays more as expected. I wanted to show you a way of looping over the characters in string where you can also have the indices in addition to the characters themselves. If we were in Java, you might do something like this, and this is not a very good way to do it in Python, but it will look familiar to you. So we'll start at index I, and then we'd say, we can't say I++ in Python because ++ doesn't exist. We'd say I plus equals 1, and then we could print I followed by the letter. Here, let's do, let's do this. Okay, so when I run it now, here, let's reverse these so that we're starting with index 0. So this is not really displaying the indices. This is really displaying a number that is the same as the index. So here I've got 0t, 1h, and so on. There are much better ways of doing this in Python. Let me show you 2. So if you wanted to do something that was more directly like that, you could do this. You could say for I in range that goes up to the length of the string. So len is a function that will tell you the length of whatever the input is. And in this case, it will display, what have I done? Oh, why do I keep trying to say letter here? Message I. So I'm using the index I to access character at index I. So that's the same. There's another way of doing the same thing, which is instead of saying for letter in message, you can use the enumerate function, and enumerate will return 2 values in a tuple. It will return the index and the value in that index. So I'll be assigning those two to these 2 different variables. I'm assigning the index to I and the value to letter. And so now I don't need to actually display that. I can display letter itself. And again, that's giving me the same thing. So enumerate is a useful way of having both indices and values. Let's end with some actual functions that you can run on strings. So I'll define a new message, hello there. So one nice thing you can do is you can count instances. So here I'm saying message.count e, and it's returned 3 because there are 3 e. You can optionally specify a starting and an ending index. So I could say count all e's starting at index 3, and that will default going to the end. Or you could start at 3 and end at, let's say, 8. So between index 3 and index 8, there are no e's at all. If you wanted to know the index at which a particular substring begins, in Java there's the index of method. In Python there's find. So I can say find e, and there it's returned to index 1, which is the first occurrence of e. I can also specify a starting index. So if I'm trying to find e starting at index 2, the next one occurs at index 8. Python also has a rfind, which means find from the right. So index 10 is the rightmost occurrence of e. Let's define another message to be space, 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 hello, space, space, space. So in Java, if you wanted to eliminate that leading and trailing white space, there's a method called trim. In Python, it's called strip. So there you can see I've stripped away the leading and trailing white space. There's also, and when I say stripped away, strings are immutable, so it didn't actually change my message. There's my original message. It returned a new string for which the leading and trailing white space has been stripped. There's also lstrip, which only strips on the left, and there's rstrip, which only strips on the right. There's, there is upper, which converts to uppercase. If I actually wanted to change the value inside my string, I could do this, and now you can see that message really is uppercase. So then I could say something like message.isUpper, and that will return Boolean true because it's all in uppercase. Message.isLower would return, message.isLower would return false because it's not lowercase. But if I said message lower, now you can see message is lowercase, and if I did is lower, it should return true. All right, I think the last one I want to show you is split, which works just the same way as it does in Java. Let's do some random statistics separated by commas. If I say message split on comma, as you can see, it's returned a list with each of the things separated by commas. If I say split on empty string, I cannot split on an empty string. If I split, there we go. So if I split with no argument at all, what has it done? It's split by space by default. You might be thinking right now, wait a minute, if you can't split it on an empty string, how do you split your string into individual characters? And the answer is it's already split into individual characters. Remember, we can access them using the array syntax. If you actually want to explicitly convert your string into a list, you would cast it to a list by saying list message, and there you see you've got a list. All right, that's it for this time. Next time we'll talk about more things that you can do with list.